A mother from Phoenix, Arizona, discovers her 16-year-old son, David, wearing diapers in his bedroom, leaving her confused and desperate for answers about why her previously independent teenager had regressed to such an infantile state. But what she would learn about her trusted brother-in-law, Mitchell, the man who had been like a father to her son for over 8 years, would shatter everything she thought she knew about the people closest to her family. Rebecca Hartwell had always considered herself fortunate when it came to family support. As a single mother raising her son David in the quiet suburbs of Phoenix, she had relied heavily on her late husband's brother, Mitchell Crawford, who had stepped into the role of father figure without hesitation after her husband's tragic death in a construction accident 8 years earlier. Mitchell was everything a grieving family could ask for in those dark days. He was patient, reliable, and genuinely seemed to care about David's well-being. Every weekend he would pick up David for what they called their uncle and nephew time: fishing trips, baseball games, camping adventures, and sometimes just quiet afternoons at Mitchell's house, where David could escape the sometimes overwhelming presence of his mother's grief. The arrangement had been a blessing for Rebecca, who struggled to balance her job as a nursing assistant with single motherhood. Mitchell never asked for anything in return, never made her feel like a burden, and always seemed genuinely happy to spend time with David. He attended every school play, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference alongside Rebecca. To the outside world, and even to Rebecca herself, Mitchell was the perfect uncle, selfless, dedicated, and trustworthy. David had always been a bright, energetic child. Even after losing his father at age 8, he had shown remarkable resilience. With Mitchell's support and Rebecca's love, he had maintained good grades, made friends easily, and participated in various school activities. He was particularly close to Mitchell, often preferring to confide in his uncle rather than his mother about typical teenage concerns: girls, school pressures, and future plans. The Hartwell home on Sunset Drive was modest but warm. Rebecca had worked hard to create a stable environment for David, and Mitchell's presence had made their small family feel complete. Neighbors often commented on how lucky Rebecca was to have such a supportive brother-in-law, and Rebecca agreed wholeheartedly. Mitchell Crawford was 42 years old, unmarried, and worked as an accountant for a local firm. He lived alone in a well-maintained house about 20 minutes from Rebecca and David. His life appeared organized and predictable. He attended church regularly, maintained his lawn meticulously, and was known in the neighborhood as the helpful guy who would lend tools or offer assistance with home repairs. To Rebecca, Mitchell represented stability and masculine influence that David needed. She trusted him completely, never questioning the amount of time he spent with David or the private conversations they shared. When David began spending entire weekends at Mitchell's house, Rebecca saw it as a positive sign that her son was comfortable with the arrangement and that Mitchell was providing the guidance she sometimes felt unqualified to give. But over the past 6 months, Rebecca had begun noticing subtle changes in David's behavior. The once confident teenager had become increasingly withdrawn and anxious. His grades, which had always been solid, began to slip. He lost interest in soccer, an activity he had previously loved. Most concerning was his reluctance to discuss his time with Mitchell, something that had never been an issue before. When Rebecca asked about their weekend activities, David would give vague responses or change the subject entirely. She attributed these changes to typical teenage moodiness and the natural process of adolescence, seeking independence from family members. Never did she imagine that something far more troubling was taking place during those trusted weekend visits. The changes became more pronounced as winter approached. David began having nightmares, though he refused to discuss their content. He became increasingly particular about his privacy, installing a lock on his bedroom door, and becoming upset if Rebecca entered his room unexpectedly. His appetite decreased, and he lost weight that his already thin frame could not afford to lose. Rebecca mentioned her concerns to Mitchell during one of their regular phone conversations, but he dismissed her worries as normal teenage development. He assured her that David seemed fine during their time together, and suggested that perhaps David was simply adjusting to the increased academic pressures of his sophomore year in high school. Mitchell's reassurance provided temporary comfort to Rebecca, who valued his opinion and trusted his judgment completely. After all, He spent more one-on-one time with David than anyone else, and had always been perceptive about the teenager's needs and moods. If Mitchell thought everything was normal, Rebecca felt she could set aside her maternal instincts and trust his assessment. On a crisp Saturday morning in February, Rebecca returned home earlier than expected from her shift at the hospital. The emergency department had been unusually quiet, and her supervisor had released her 2 hours ahead of schedule. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed Mitchell's car was not there, which surprised her since David had supposedly spent the night at his uncle's house, and they had planned to work on a school project together that morning. Entering through the front door, Rebecca called out to announce her early arrival, but received no response. The house felt unusually quiet, with an almost heavy atmosphere that made her pause in the entryway. She assumed David might still be sleeping, as teenage boys were notorious for their ability to sleep through loud noises. Walking toward the kitchen to prepare coffee, Rebecca heard a sound from upstairs that made her stop. It was a soft whimpering sound, almost like crying, but muffled and barely audible. Her maternal instincts immediately kicked in, and she quietly climbed the stairs toward David's bedroom. Standing outside his door, Rebecca could hear more distinct sounds. Definitely crying, but mixed with what sounded like whispered self-soothing. She knocked gently and called David's name, but the sounds stopped abruptly, replaced by complete silence. "David, honey, are you okay?" she called through the door. "I came home early from work." "I am fine, Mom," came the muffled response, but his voice sounded strained and younger than his 16 years. "Just give me a few minutes." Rebecca waited, but something in his tone triggered an alarm in her mind. This was not the typical reluctance of a teenager who did not want to be disturbed. This was something else entirely. Fear, shame, or perhaps both. After waiting several minutes without hearing any movement from inside the room, Rebecca's concern overcame her respect for David's privacy. She tried the door handle and found it unlocked, which surprised her since David had been so particular about keeping his door locked recently. Opening the door slowly, Rebecca was completely unprepared for what she discovered. David was sitting on the edge of his bed, fully clothed but with obvious evidence that he was wearing something bulky underneath his pants. His face was tear-streaked and red with embarrassment, and his entire posture spoke of shame and defeat. "David, what is wrong?" Rebecca asked, stepping into the room with growing alarm. "Are you hurt? Are you sick?" David could not meet her eyes. He sat with his shoulders hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, looking more like a frightened child than the confident teenager she had raised. The sight broke Rebecca's heart and filled her with a terror she could not yet name. "I cannot explain it," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "You would not understand." Rebecca approached slowly, as if David were a wounded animal that might flee at any sudden movement. As she got closer, the truth became undeniable. Her 16-year-old son was wearing a diaper. The realization hit her like a physical blow, leaving her momentarily speechless and struggling to process what she was seeing. "David, sweetheart, what is happening here?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice calm and non-judgmental, despite the chaos in her mind. "Please help me understand." The question opened floodgates of emotion that David had apparently been holding back for a long time. He began sobbing with an intensity that frightened Rebecca, his whole body shaking with the force of his tears. Between sobs, he tried to speak, but his words were largely incomprehensible. Rebecca sat beside him on the bed and pulled him into her arms, something she had not done in years. David did not resist. Instead, he collapsed against her like a much younger child, seeking comfort. She held him while he cried, running her fingers through his hair and whispering reassurances, all while her mind raced to understand what could have caused such regression in her previously mature son. As David's sobs gradually subsided, Rebecca gently asked again for an explanation. This time, David's response chilled her to the bone. "Uncle Mitchell says I need them," David whispered against her shoulder. "He says I cannot be trusted to be a big boy anymore." The words hit Rebecca like a punch to the stomach. In that moment, everything changed. The pieces of a puzzle she had not even realized existed began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Rebecca's world shifted on its axis as David's words sank in. She pulled back to look at her son's face, searching for some sign that she had misunderstood, but the shame and fear in his eyes confirmed her worst suspicions. "What do you mean, Uncle Mitchell? Says you need them?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely steady. "What exactly has Uncle Mitchell been telling you?" David's response came in fragments, broken by fresh tears and long pauses as he struggled to find words for experiences he had been taught to keep secret. Over the course of the next 2 hours, a horrifying picture emerged of systematic psychological manipulation that had been taking place for over 3 years. Mitchell had begun the process gradually, so subtly that David had not recognized what was happening until he was completely trapped in a web of shame and confusion. It started with seemingly innocent comments about David's maturity level, suggestions that he was not as grown up as other boys his age, and gentle corrections of his behavior that slowly eroded his confidence. During their weekend visits, Mitchell had created a separate set of rules that applied only when David was at his house. These rules became increasingly infantile over time. David was required to ask permission for basic activities, to eat certain foods with his hands rather than utensils, and to follow a strict bedtime routine that included Mitchell checking on him throughout the night. Mitchell had masterfully used David's natural respect for authority and his desperate need for male approval to normalize increasingly inappropriate behavior. He convinced David that their arrangement was special, that it demonstrated trust and love, and that David's mother would not understand their unique relationship. The diapers had been introduced as a consequence for normal teenage behaviors that Mitchell labeled as immature or inappropriate. When David had mentioned being interested in a girl at school, Mitchell had responded with disappointed lectures about David not being ready for such adult concerns. When David had disagreed with Mitchell's opinion about a movie, it became evidence that David could not handle mature content. Mitchell had created an elaborate system of punishments and rewards that kept David constantly off balance and seeking approval. The punishments always involved regression to more childlike states, earlier bedtimes, simpler foods, loss of privileges, and eventually the requirement to wear diapers during visits. Most insidiously, Mitchell had convinced David that these regressions were for his own good, that they would help him develop proper maturity gradually. He had isolated David from potential sources of support by suggesting that other people, including Rebecca, would not understand their special bond and might try to interfere with David's development. The psychological manipulation had been so complete that David had begun to question his own perceptions of normal behavior. Mitchell had convinced him that his desire for independence was actually selfishness, that his interest in typical teenage activities was premature, and that his discomfort with their arrangement was evidence of his immaturity. As Rebecca listened to her son's painful revelations, she felt a combination of rage and crushing guilt. How had she missed the signs? How had she trusted Mitchell so completely that she had handed over her child to a predator? The man she had welcomed into their family, the man she had trusted with her most precious relationship, had been systematically destroying her son's sense of self. David's account revealed that Mitchell had been careful to maintain his public persona while conducting his manipulation in private. During family gatherings or public outings, Mitchell behaved as the perfect uncle, showing appropriate affection and respect for David's autonomy. It was only during their private time that the true nature of their relationship emerged. The scope of Mitchell's control became clear, as David described how his uncle had monitored his friendships, discouraged him from dating, and gradually isolated him from peers who might have helped him recognize that his experiences were not normal. Mitchell had convinced David that his friends were bad influences, and that David was too immature to handle typical teenage relationships. Mitchell had also used David's love for his mother as a weapon, suggesting that David's immaturity was causing Rebecca stress, and that their special arrangement was actually helping to protect her from worry. This manipulation had prevented David from confiding in Rebecca and had made him feel responsible for maintaining the secret. The revelation that shook Rebecca most deeply was David's description of how Mitchell had gradually convinced him that he was incapable of making good decisions for himself. Mitchell had created situations where David would fail, and then used these failures as evidence that David needed more supervision and control. What Rebecca had interpreted as Mitchell's dedication to David's well-being had actually been a calculated campaign to undermine her son's confidence and independence. As the full scope of Mitchell's betrayal became clear, Rebecca felt a fury unlike anything she had ever experienced. The man she had trusted, the man she had believed was helping her son, had been conducting a years-long campaign of psychological abuse designed to maintain control over David. But beneath her rage was an even more powerful emotion, a fierce protective love for her son, and a determination to help him reclaim his sense of self and his rightful place in the world. The confrontation with Mitchell Crawford took place 3 days later, after Rebecca had consulted with a therapist who specialized in psychological abuse and had begun to understand the full scope of what David had endured. She had also contacted law enforcement, though the psychological nature of the abuse made prosecution challenging. When Mitchell arrived for what he believed would be a routine visit, he found Rebecca waiting for him, with a calm determination that should have warned him that everything had changed. David was not present. Rebecca had arranged for him to stay with a trusted neighbor while she handled the confrontation. Mitchell's reaction to being exposed was both predictable and chilling. He initially denied everything, then attempted to minimize his actions, and finally tried to convince Rebecca that his methods had been necessary for David's development. His complete lack of remorse and his attempts to justify his behavior confirmed to Rebecca that she was dealing with someone who had never truly cared about David's well-being. The most revealing moment came when Mitchell attempted to maintain his facade of being the concerned uncle. He suggested that David was fabricating or exaggerating their interactions, and that Rebecca was overreacting to normal disciplinary measures. His willingness to discredit David's account showed Rebecca the depths of his manipulation and his complete disregard for the damage he had caused. Rebecca's response was swift and definitive. She banned Mitchell from any contact with David, threatened legal action if he attempted to reach out to her son, and made it clear that their family relationship was permanently severed. Mitchell's attempts to argue or negotiate were met with unwavering resolve. The journey toward healing proved to be long, but ultimately successful. David began working with a therapist who specialized in helping adolescents recover from psychological manipulation. The process was difficult, as David had to learn to trust his own perceptions again and to recognize that his natural desires for independence and age-appropriate experiences were healthy, not selfish. Rebecca also sought counseling to deal with her guilt and to learn how to support David's recovery without becoming overprotective. She learned that Mitchell's manipulation had been so sophisticated that even trained professionals might have missed the signs, and that her trust in a family member was not a character flaw but a normal human response. The healing process involved helping David reclaim his sense of autonomy gradually. With his therapist's guidance, Rebecca learned to involve David in decisions about his own care, and to respect his boundaries while still providing appropriate support. David slowly began to trust his own judgment again, and to recognize that his feelings and preferences were valid. One of the most important aspects of David's recovery was reconnecting with peers his own age. The therapist helped David understand that Mitchell's isolation tactics had been designed to maintain control, not to protect him. With support, David began rebuilding friendships and engaging in age-appropriate activities that Mitchell had discouraged. The process was not without setbacks. David experienced periods of doubt and regression, times when he questioned whether his perceptions were accurate or whether he deserved the independence he was reclaiming. But with consistent support and professional guidance, these setbacks became less frequent and less severe. Rebecca's relationship with David deepened through this process. The experience taught them both the importance of open communication and created a foundation of trust that had not existed before. David learned that he could share difficult experiences with his mother without judgment, and Rebecca learned to listen without immediately trying to fix everything. 6 months after the confrontation with Mitchell, David was thriving. His grades had improved, he had rejoined the soccer team, and he was dating a classmate with Rebecca's support and encouragement. Most importantly, he had reclaimed his sense of self and his confidence in his own perceptions and decisions. The experience taught both Rebecca and David valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation and the importance of trusting instincts when something feels wrong. They learned that predators often target families by appearing helpful and trustworthy, and that isolation is a key component of psychological abuse. David's recovery became a source of strength for other young people facing similar situations. With his therapist's support, he eventually became comfortable sharing his experience with other adolescents who had experienced manipulation or abuse, helping them recognize that recovery was possible and that they were not responsible for the adults who had betrayed their trust. The legal system's response was limited due to the psychological nature of Mitchell's abuse, but Rebecca found that protecting David and helping him heal was more important than seeking punishment. Mitchell's actions had consequences in other areas of his life, as word of his behavior spread through their community, but Rebecca's focus remained on David's well-being rather than revenge. 2 years later, David had grown into a confident young man who maintained healthy relationships and made decisions based on his own judgment, rather than seeking approval from authority figures. He had learned to recognize manipulation tactics and to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. The experience, while traumatic, had ultimately strengthened the bond between Rebecca and David, and had taught them both about resilience, recovery, and the power of speaking truth about difficult experiences. David's courage in finally revealing what had been happening to him had not only freed him from Mitchell's control, but had also prevented other potential victims from experiencing similar abuse. Their story became a testament to the fact that even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation can be overcome with proper support, professional help, and the courage to speak out. David's recovery proved that young people have the strength to reclaim their lives and their sense of self, even after experiencing profound betrayal by trusted adults. If this account has resonated with you or brought up concerns about someone in your own life, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful step toward healing is simply acknowledging that something is not right and reaching out for support. Your voice and your experience matter, and sharing your perspective might help someone else who needs to hear that they are not alone in their struggle.